Hi everybody and welcome to Simply Scuba and the deep dive. Today's deep dive is taking a closer look at one of my favourite pieces of scuba diving equipment, the bolt snap. As for sheer numbers, I have more bolt snaps on my person when I'm diving than any other piece of equipment, and that's because they're just so darn useful and better than a lot of the alternatives on the market. When divers first start out, we're usually most exposed to carabiners as quick clips to attach things to yourself so you don't drop and lose them, but carabiners are pretty dangerous for scuba divers. For climbers and hikers, a carabiner is a practical little clip, but for scuba divers, they're actually pretty bad. The first thing is that they're just not made for marine environments. A lot of carabiners are aluminium, which means they're nice and light, but it still means that they need to be washed much more thoroughly. Otherwise, it just corrodes and it pits in seawater. But more importantly, carabiners don't need you to consciously do something to open up that gate and let something in. They will clip onto anything, which means that you can just swim against the line and not even know it, or ghost gear and just get yourself caught. Only this time, unlike getting snagged on something, you can't swim backwards because that won't help because you're now clipped onto that line. So scuba divers prefer bolt snaps. They require a positive action to open up that gate, but they do come in lots of different shapes and styles and sizes because they all have different uses. So let's dive a little deeper and take a closer look at bolt snaps. So the first thing is that the material that bolt snaps is made from. So a bolt snap for scuba diving, they're typically either made from brass or steel. Steel is by far better than brass for a whole range of reasons. Brass is good because it's more resistant to corrosion and it's a cheaper metal. It's also a little bit lighter as well, but it is a soft metal, so they do bend fairly easily. Steel bolt snaps are usually the best, but not all bolt snaps are made the same. You get cheap, nasty bolt snaps and you get decent bolt snaps. Steel bolt snaps are made from marine grade steel, so they're pretty rust resistant, and they're nice and strong as well, so they don't tend to bend unless you put a lot of force on them. You'll often get a brass bolt snap as just a free one when you buy a spool or something, but to be honest, I just throw them straight in a drawer and I never use them. I just swap it out from one of my nice steel bolt snaps, or actually invest in a decent steel bolt snap before I use a brass one. I'm somewhat of a bolt snap snob that way. Right at one end, you will have what's called the hook. The hook is just a J-shaped hook, which is meant to catch whatever you are clipping. So they're typically fairly small because you'll only ever really clip one thing with each bolt snap. You don't tend to clip a bolt snap onto multiple things, and we don't clip things onto particularly large lines neither with a bolt snap. You use something else for that, like a shackle. Closing the hook is the gate. The gate is what makes bolt snaps different to carabiners. Instead of a swing spring mechanism, bolt snap gates are a straight piston mechanism that default in the closed position. So no matter how hard you push on that gate as an inanimate object to try and get in, it will not open. To be able to open the gate, you have the trigger. So the trigger is attached onto the gate and the piston as well. And for divers, these are pretty sort of chunky, the actual trigger itself, so that we can use them even with big chunky gloves. Underneath the gate and the piston on the inside of the body of the bolt snap, there will be an internal spring that keeps the gate closed. It's important to give these a very good wash and dry after your dive to keep salt crystals and rust from forming, so that the spring doesn't fault. So give them a good wash, a good dry, and it will just last for years. Down the body of the bolt snap, it will just be a straight section of metal, and on the other end, it will either have a mirror hook on the far end that makes it into a double ender, or it will have an eye, just a loop that swivels on a single ender. The size and shape of the eye depends on what the bolt snap is intended for, but we'll get into that in a moment. So double enders, as the name suggests, they have two hooks, one on either end, and these are great for attaching two things together temporarily. Double enders are used for things like spools or sort of quick attached tools where you want to clip a spool onto a D-ring quickly, but you don't always want to have that bolt snap physically fixed onto your spool for all time, because that would just make winding your spool just hard. So you have a spring gate on either end. Double enders tend to be fairly uniform, they just come in different sizes. The only thing that really changes on a double ender is just the length and the overall size of the hook. Small double enders, they're fine for warm water use. They're smaller, which makes them a lot neater, and they'll have a nice small neat little trigger, but trying to use one of these, a really small double ender, whilst cold water diving with big gloves is just fiddly and pretty hard. For cold water diving or where you're just wearing clunky gloves, you want a large double ender with a long trigger for your thumb to actually get hold of. So if in doubt, with double enders, the bigger the better, really. Single enders are more permanent, so single end bolt snaps are made to be tied to something to act as an attachment point, either on an accessory like a torch so that you can clip it off somewhere safe when you're not using it, or a hose so that it stays where you want it to, instead of using some other kind of hose retainer. Small bolt snaps with teeny tiny little eyes, so these are made for tools and second stages. You don't want a big, huge, clunky bolt snap attached to a small diddy torch or onto your second stage, because it would just hang a little bit too far away from your body if something's clipped off onto a D-ring. And if it's on a second stage, a huge bolt snap is just going to get in the way. So you want something nice and neat, something nice and small and compact. Slightly larger bolt snaps with a fairly compact eye still. These are again for cold water use, so it's just a little bit bigger, it's a more sensible size, so you can use it with thick gloves. A bolt snap with a large but thin eye. So these are made for light things that need controlling, like your SPG hose. The eye will be large enough to be able to fit a finger through, which lets you get hold of that point and the bolt snap to move it around easily, and it's much more intuitive to be able to sort of clip it off onto a D-ring. The largest bolt snaps, which have a big, thick, round eye, so these are made for heavy items like cylinders, so that you can side mount that cylinder, or you can clip the cylinder off onto a fixed point and come back to it later. You can still get a finger through that eye, but the eye itself is made from a thicker metal for just extra weight of your tank. So bolt snaps aren't perfect, so they're better than a carabiner for scuba diving, but they do need to be used properly. So the first problem with bolt snaps is that most divers clip a bolt snap to a spool like this when they first start out, because it's kind of the most obvious way to clip off, isn't it? But bolt snaps can undo themselves just like this when they're unattended. And this is why we clip them off onto small caliber things like D-rings, because as soon as it's against something big and flat, if it twists in the wrong direction, it can just let go. If you're going to clip a bolt snap to a spool, then the preferred technique is to have a small section of the line through one of the holes of the spool, allow about 6 inches or so of line, and then clip the bolt snap onto it like this, and then give it a good twist and then let it go back through the gate. That way the bolt snap can never twist on the hard body of the spool and open it all by itself. It requires you, the diver, to physically open that gate. So there were bolt snap. I was going to do a deep dive on just clips in general, but there's so many out there, and bolt snaps kind of deserve their own deep dive. As I said earlier, there are bolt snaps and there are bolt snaps. The important thing is not to go cheap when you're sort of buying bolt snaps, because you'll find a cheap bolt snap, okay, it might be a couple quid cheaper, but it has a really raspy action which will just annoy you and actually snag. And on a dive, if you're wearing thick gloves, you just won't be able to use it. So it's worth investing a little bit extra and getting a decent bolt snap. Most bolt snaps are a fairly generic design with that kind of swooped back, but there are a couple of brands like X-Deep who are really starting to stir up the classic bolt snap design and improving the ease of use. So keep an eye out, because the small differences and improvements in bolt snaps are definitely worth it, and I always keep at least one spare double ender on me at all times, just in case, because I've dropped things before and it's always useful just to have a spare double ender. But let us know in the comments below how much you appreciate a good bolt snap. Thank you for watching, and of course, safe diving.